So my background is as a board certified behavior analyst. I've been working in the field of ABA since 2008. Nancy did a wonderful introduction for me, so I do not need to go into too much detail in this area, but like I mentioned, since we opened up Early Intervention Clinic, of which I'm one of the directors, in 2019, I've been specializing in naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions for very young children, so focusing on infants, toddlers, and preschoolers exclusively in my practice. And a big personal interest of mine is parent coaching and parent involvement. This has been a skill set that we've been working really hard to build clinically among our team, because it is so important and it is different from the skills that we learned as direct care providers or as individuals working with children or with paraprofessionals. So it's a different skill set, and it's been really a really exciting learning journey for me. And I'm very excited to share that information with you. So we're going to talk a little bit about early indicators of social communication vulnerabilities. So what I mean by that, there are really a variety of diagnostic labels that we might use that include differences in the way that individuals interact and communicate with other people. So when young children are displaying some of these different developmental trajectories that include difficulties with social or communication skills, we might call this a social communication vulnerability, as it typically precedes a formal diagnosis, and it may or may not actually align with what we suspect the diagnosis may turn out to be, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit of a catch-all term, but it could be that we have a child with who has an immediate family member or sibling with a diagnosis of ASD. And so we might refer to that child as being at risk of a diagnosis of autism because of the genetic component. Or we might have a child who's displaying difficulties that are attributed to another form of neurodivergence, such as ADHD. And these can all affect a child's social expression. That being said, one of the most common majority of children who do display these social communication difficulties will later go on to be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. So we'll discuss a little bit in detail what exactly that means. But a lot of the areas and strategies that I'm going to talk about will be effective for a variety of kids with social communication difficulties. So when we talk about ASD, we talk about persistent and ongoing. This is the language of the DSM. This is not my language, but the way that it is listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what psychologists use to diagnose autism spectrum disorder, is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction, specifically in the areas of social and emotional reciprocity, nonverbal communication, and developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. So that first point there is the core diagnostic feature of ASD. And then there are some other symptoms, I guess, that go along with it. So that includes restrictive and repetitive patterns of behavior, as well as different specifications in the diagnostic process itself for autism that co-occurs with or without an intellectual disability or a language impairment. And autism is a relatively common diagnosis. 1 in 44 in the USA and 1 in 66 in Canada as of 2022. Those were the most recent statistics that I could find. So this is a relatively common thing, and chances are you know a number of individuals with autism spectrum disorder and a number of children with autism spectrum disorder as well. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific symptoms of ASD. Restrictive and repetitive behaviors is a larger category that can present in one or more of these ways that I've listed here. So this is one of the things that makes it really tricky to determine whether or not a child may be on the spectrum, because they may have one of these but not others. And some of the ones that we tend to associate might be stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, but maybe a child is really just showing a really firm adherence to insistence on sameness and inflexible routines, but none of these other none of these other signs, we may then sort of think, oh, maybe he does not have autism, but really it's one way of this category of restricted and repetitive behaviors. It's one way that that is expressed. So there's a number of different ways that we can see this, not just sort of the stereotypical ways that you might be familiar with. So it's important to note too that these behaviors aren't necessarily bad, or they don't necessarily need to be changed by default. We can talk about what a child's strengths are when it comes to these different diagnostic criteria, so to speak. But for example, we have autistic self-advocates who can express some of the difficulties with the neurological differences that they experience by being autistic. We'll often talk about how stereotypy or stimming can serve a functional purpose for them, and it can be very self-regulating. So that could be something that we maybe don't necessarily need to change right off the bat. And some of these may turn out to be a strength. For instance, there's a student that we work with who is very, very, very interested in birds and pigeons and all sorts of animals, just loves them so much, and has really developed extreme strengths in the areas of fine motor skills because of his love for drawing these birds. And he just draws them and draws them and draws them and draws them. And he does these beautiful, accurate drawings that's way above his expected age range. So while the way that these diagnostic manuals are written are often very deficit-based, it's also very important to recognize the strengths that can be present with some of these symptoms. I think it's also important to note that research in ASD is still honestly relatively new. It was first described in 1943, and that's less than 100 years ago. It was first recognized as a developmental disorder in 1980 in the DSM-3 and was first presented as a spectrum in 1987. The criteria that we currently use today was released in 2013, but there was really quite a lot of sort of different categorizing and rethinking the label of autism and what autism is over the years. And I think we're really just starting to understand it more and more. So we know that there's lots of research happening right now in terms of what's actually happening in individuals' brains and what are sort of the brain structural things that are going on. And some more recent research in this area has shown us that patterns of brain structure changes were not actually associated with diagnoses specifically. They were actually more likely to be similar amongst people with the areas with similar levels of cognitive ability, hyperactivity, and adaptive behavior. So what that means is in this study, the brain of an individual with mild autism spectrum disorder looked much more like the brain of someone diagnosed with ADHD. And this makes sense because we know there's such a wide variety of people who end up with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So we're really just starting to understand what these labels mean. And I think it's fair to say that in the future, there's probably going to be some shifting in how we diagnose these things as we learn more. It's important to note that there are many different ways that we can be neurodiverse, and autism spectrum disorder is just one of those. And then there are interrelated elements to neurodiversity where there are overlapping symptoms between autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. There's also high comorbidity of autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. And then people can have multiple things, like they could be on the spectrum and then also gifted, or also have anxiety or depression, and then these things can all interact. So I think we need to give a lot of credit to the complexity of humans and the different ways that we, all can express ourselves, and recognize that we're doing our best in a field that is rapidly changing, and doing our best to keep up and to help people as best we can within the context that we may, what we know in 5 years and 10 years may be completely different than the way that we're thinking about these things today. So when we talk about the spectrum, often what people think of when they think of somebody on the spectrum would be, these sort of functioning terms that became more and more popular as descriptors of talking about someone as being low functioning or high functioning. And really, this is not very accurate in terms of actually describing how somebody functions across their day. So this is a resource from, here's the link here, but it was developed by somebody on the spectrum. And what they're trying to get across here is that really when we look at functioning or what's really happening in the spectrum is across all of these different areas of special interests, posture, gait, difficulty with eye contact, sensory sensitivities, people may have more or less levels of functioning in these individual areas. And that's going to be unique and different for each person. They're all going to have unique strengths and differences. So one person with autism or one autistic person may not be that uncomfortable with eye contact or may not appear to be that uncomfortable with eye contact. That doesn't mean that they're not still on the spectrum. So there's a lot of different ways that this can present. Are there any questions so far about any of the content? Just a little bit of introduction and my own caveats of what I've been learning in the past few years.
I think that's really helpful. That's good.
Great.
I don't see any questions yet. You can put questions in the chat or the Q&A. We'll find them.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. So we'll talk a little bit about how social communication skills develop. These skills really do play a crucial role in learning and development. And so that's going to help us situate a little bit about how developmental differences then affect individuals and why early intervention is then important. So really, when we're talking about social communication development, when I started learning more about this area, I was actually really surprised to see just how young these skills are developing in infants. Really, these are infant development skills, because a lot of the time that I was working as a behavior interventionist early in my career, I was working with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds. You're not as aware of what are really those key foundational early skills that carry through and lead to these other things that we see later in development. But things like face recognition happens as soon as 6 to 7 months. Kids start responding differentially to eye gaze at 4 months of age. Joint attention, the precursors or foundations for joint attention skills and gaze pattern shifting happens at 3 months of age. And babies are able to start to perceive emotions around 7 months of age. So this was something that really blew my mind when I started to learn more about it. But it makes sense. Our social community in general is necessary for survival. As humans, we rely on each other in being in a social environment. So there's definitely an evolutionary component of our development of social skills. And infants as well are so helpless, for lack of a better word. They need caregivers around them. So these communication and interaction skills are really important. But they learn so much through observation, much before their motor systems are developed enough for them to be able to actually act on and demonstrate what they know. But there's a lot of understanding that happens with infants in that first year of life. So I mentioned a little bit joint attention here. This is a big one that we tend to talk about with autism specifically, as it's a skill that autistic kids tend not to show. But joint attention really is the coordinating of two people around one thing, and the fact that they both know and recognize that they're coordinating about something. So I'm going to show us a little video here to give you a little break from hearing my voice. And we'll talk a little bit about this as well. But this is specifically looking at joint attention with young children.
From about 6 months, infants can start to involve external objects in face-to-face interaction. Progress in their motor development, for example, sitting up on their own or crawling, enables them to reach and touch different things in their surroundings. When an infant and their caregiver both coordinate their attention to a specific object or event and are aware that they are both doing so, we say they are in joint attention.
Què són aquestes joguines? Oh, això vols? Si són les claus del cotxe, que són meves. Mira què fa aquesta, mira. Un pito.
Episodes of joint attention are the ideal setting in which babies can come to understand how people use words.
T'agraden els colors? Que maco, És groc, és vermell.
When adults and babies are interested in the same object and the adult talks about its name or its main features, it is particularly easy for babies to pick up on the function of what the adult is saying.
Qui és aquesta nena? Qui és aquesta nena?
So that is just a little bit about joint attention, and it also speaks very nicely to the importance of joint attention for early language development. I think when I was first learning about joint attention as an undergraduate student in a 200 level developmental psychology class, we talked about it a lot as being sort of pointing and responding to points, but really it starts much earlier than when kids are able to do that, which is about a year to 2 years would be when sort of the pointing and responding to points is coming out. But yeah, we're really looking at these foundational and early skills that develop in children. It is hypothesized that infants are actually more so sensitive to social stimuli than adults, right? That we sort of learn to tune out some of the social stuff that happens around us, and we learn what's important, what's not. But infants, their job is to learn about the world. And so they're especially wired to pay attention to social stimuli, as this is such a key part of learning and development. So a few of the other social communication development milestones, they can discriminate the movement of living versus non-living organisms. And they can also start to understand others' actions and predict, what someone may or may not do. They're sort of little walking science experiments that they're sort of observing and seeing what's going to happen. And if it's surprising to them, they'll show that. So it's really interesting how these skills develop. And these are the early versions, but when there's difficulties in the development of these skills, this can have a cascading effect then on how children learn and what they learn. And that's exactly why early intervention is so crucial. So none of the differences that we see in autism spectrum disorder are universally present in autism and not present in other disorders or other areas. So that's sort of why I talked as well about the neurodivergence in all of these different areas. But there's so many neural connections happening in our brains that interact to make learning and behavior happen. And those happen in really, really complicated ways and with lots and lots of repetition and practice. So there's a lot of different ways that these differences in the brain development of autistic children can affect later skill development. And that's also going to interact with their experiences and what they're exposed to. So that's also why early intervention can be so effective. But really, when we look at each profile of each student, it's a unique combination of strengths and differences, and they develop as a really complex interaction of the individual's neurology with their environment. So we'll talk a little bit about neural plasticity. So when your brain is developing or is the way that it is, neuroplasticity really is the ability for the brain, the nervous system to reorganize based on experiential input. So one example of this is if you are someone who, they've done studies that a violinist, say, would have more neural activation in the part of her brain associated with whichever hand you use, whichever is your fingering hand when you play the violin, So there's structural changes in the brain that happen as a result of this person's practice and experience with doing sorry, I got distracted by the chat for a second. So yeah, with that experiential input actually has effects on how that person's brain is wired. And the ability of the nervous system to reorganize or change the way that it's setting up is most constant and rapid during the first 3 years of life. So we know that there's critical periods where it's easier to learn certain skills. So we talk about critical or sensitive periods for language acquisition. So that's a time in a child's life where brain cell connections are more receptive to influence. And it's more likely that they're going to be able to learn these things if you do it before a certain age. But brains of young children are much more plastic than older children, meaning they are able to reorganize much more quickly, because in those first 3 years of life, children are developing neural connections at the incredible rate, had to leave the word incredible in there, of 1 million per second. So they're really learning everything about the world, and it's new and it's fresh. And the neural connections haven't yet been solidified through activation, because what happens with neural pathways is that if they're not being used, they tend to sort of die out and disappear and go away. And the ones that are being used in practice become more ingrained and also more difficult to change. So that's a little bit of the brain science background behind this. So some of the differences that we know that occur in autistic brain development is there tends to be a high volume of synaptic connections or a high volume of neural pruning, or sorry, of neural connections. So what happens with, we were just talking about connections being developed, and then if they're not being used, they sort of wither and die off and go away. And that process is referred to as pruning. So in typical development, synaptic pruning would occur where these unused connections are sort of cut off. And that may not be happening as readily for individuals who are autistic. And another characteristic that's been noted in research is that autistic individuals tend to have larger than average head size. So that could be, there are two sort of theories as to why this is. It could be due to rapid cell proliferation without that neural pruning. So you have a lot of neurons that are not super well organized, and it might make it difficult to form some of these connections. And there is some evidence as well to say that there might be some biological reasons for inflammation happening. It could be some form of immune dysfunctioning, but this is a really new and emerging area of research. We're not really totally sure exactly what is happening there. But one thing that we do know quite readily is that there is reduced activity in the social areas of the brain as compared to typically developing people. But I think it's really important to note too, when we talk about neural connections and we talk about these skills, to really pay attention to how complicated all of these skills that we're talking about are. So if we talk about joint attention and we talk about a child pointing to show interest in a toy, that involves the coordination of many different centers of the brain already. So we're looking at visual perception. They have to be able to see what's happening and gauge like where they're pointing to in coordination with their motor behavior, their eyes and their hands, and coordinating that information. There's also attentional shifting that has to happen. So thinking about one thing and then shifting back to an adult if we're engaging in joint attention. And then there's also emotion centers of the brain that are involved in that. So even when we look at a relatively simple skill, if we take it back to what's actually happening in the brain, we can see that it's a really complicated sort of dance with all of these systems that may or may not be organized as cleanly or effectively for autistic individuals. And so that may contribute to some of the difficulties. So when we talk about some of the things that we reviewed with the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder and some of the social communication skills, what we end up with is essentially a this is an oversimplification, but a hyperfixation on objects, more attention that's paid to sensory components of objects, and atypical object exploration. And these tend to lead to autistic children and young autistic children to focus more on objects than on people. And this also leads them to be more interested and rewarded by objects. So spending more time looking at objects because that's what has become really fun. And yeah, and that then leads to less time interacting with people, which ultimately leads to less opportunities for learning. And then that can have cascading effects, as I'm sure you can imagine. There can be this hyperactivation of reward circuitry in the brain that is associated with restricted interests. So those things that are just so exciting and fun, there's something happening in the brain that is making that happen, where the individual is experiencing intense reward with relation to these really preferred topics and interests, and generally less attention to people, less attention to social opportunities. So there's lots of missed opportunities for just picking up information in the environment, and less opportunities for finding social interaction rewarding and fun. So those are two things that I'm sure you can imagine, you know, depending on how often that's happening or how ingrained this is. There's many different, you know, levels of hyperfixation and levels of attention to social stimuli, but that can have cascading effects then. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the early indicators of ASD, and it does look different for really young children than it does for older children. So it's really important to note that we know a lot about autism spectrum disorder at this point, and that screening and signs and symptoms of ASD can be seen in young children as early as 9 to 16 months. So some of the things to look out for, we talked already about how babies are really naturally social. So if it's hard to get your baby to look at your face or look towards you or look at you, that might be an early indicator. Babies also tend to share their enjoyment. So if your child looks happy, but they're not actually sharing that with you. So they may smile, they may be, you can tell that they like something or they're happy about something, but they're not checking back in with you about it. Some children also may have sort of a more flat facial expression or affect across the day. They may not smile as much. It might be harder to get them to show emotion. Yeah, if babies are really sharing their interest with you, often the first gestures that sort of emerge would be showing, pointing, and then later talking, you know, making sounds or vocalizations or words to draw your attention to stuff. And another indicator would be if children really respond to their name or other bids for attention. So if you're saying things like, oh, wave, or say bye-bye, or come here, or things like that, and children just aren't picking up on those cues or aren't even sort of noticing that they're happening, that would be an indicator of ASD. I forgot to mention when I jumped into this that these resources are from an organization called Autism Navigator that I will talk a little bit more about. But they also have a great lookbook, which I pulled this from, and you can access on their website, that shows you different photo examples as well. So these examples are from the lookbook. But other indicators would be a lack of gestures, and not, you know, there are many different gestures that young kids can start to develop, like clapping, handing something to you, pointing, we talked about already, but, you know, or, you know, saying shh, even things like that. So if that's really limited or not seeming to come along, that could be an indicator. Sometimes it might be difficult as well for a kid with autism to look at you and use a gesture and sound. So they might be able to look at you and they might be able to use a gesture, but they can't do both at the same time or do both of them together. So that would be an example in the picture of, you know, coordinating attention and using the shh gesture. Imitating or pretending. This was something that really shocked me when I had my daughter, and she just started copying things that I did out of the blue. That was yeah, something I wasn't used to seeing from young kids. So it's really kind of baffling how sort of seamless it is when things are just unfolding in that way. Another very common sign is using you or your hand as a tool. So moving or pulling your hand or placing your hand on an object to get you to open it without looking at you or without acknowledging you in any sort of way, and showing a ton of interest in objects rather than people.
I just wanted to say that these slides will be sent out in our follow-up email.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you can always look at these in more detail there. I think it's important to review these, even though it's a little lengthy, because we talked about the diagnostic criteria, and we talked about those sort of 3 major areas. But really, there's so many different ways that this can be expressed in young children. And young children, you know, they're all developing. So it's really hard to know what is or is not typical. So other indicators that we might look for are unusual movements of fingers or hands, such as stiffening or flaring that you see in this photo here, or unusual body postures. Lining up, arranging, ordering objects is a common one, but also spinning or throwing or peering out of the corner of your eye and things like that can be repetitive movements that children might engage in. And developing rituals and getting upset when they change. So this is a little bit stronger than just having a preference that something happens in a particular way and being a little bit upset when it changes, but able to sort of move on. Often with these rituals, it's a very, very deep need for things to happen in a particular way, and a big problem if that's not followed through with. And this is the last slide for indicators, but excessive interest in certain objects or activities where it's really difficult to shift focus away and they get stuck or overly focused on this. So in this picture, you see the little girl picking up and dropping the sand. And I'm just going to note, my daughter's 16 months old right now, and this is something that she started doing at a young age. And of course, at first I was like, oh, well, she has autism. That just must be what it is. But one of the things that is so tricky about these signs is it is things that all kids do. It's really these subtle differences about the intensity and the frequency and the amount and how much it matters if I don't get to do it that really differentiates this. So lots of kids will pick up sand and throw it as ways of sort of exploring the world. But if you can't get them to do something else, or if you stop them, it's a big problem. That would show you that it's excessive interest in this area. Kids may also be very fixated or focused on unusual objects. So I've had kids who, you know, carry around kitchen utensils with them and they're just very attached to like the whisk or something like that. They may have unusual reactions to sound, sights, or textures, or strong reactions to unusual sensory experiences. So like touching Play-Doh might make them gag or something like that. So here's a little bit of a video that just sort of covers some of the stuff that we went over and kind of shows you some examples. So you'll see a little bit of interactions with a child and some toy materials and an adult, and some commentary around so all of the different things that this child is doing. And then another contrasting that with a child on the spectrum.
He understands that food, spoons, plates, and eating go together. As he creates a pretend play activity, he remains aware of the people nearby. He enjoys incorporating social interaction into his play and offers the lady a bite.
Thank you. That sure is tasty.
He is able to pay attention to the lady, the doll, and the pretend food all at once. He shares his excitement about the toys with the lady, looking at her and smiling. After the lady comments that the food is hot, he links his play and language to her idea.
It's okay now. It's cool. It's nice and cool then. Yeah.
Here, he imitates the lady's action with the pretend lipstick.
Oh, my lips look pretty now. My lipstick on. Oh, it doesn't.
This helps him to learn new play skills and at the same time synchronize his actions with the actions of others.
Yeah, she has lipstick on. Oh, just like mommy wears. You look so pretty. Thank you.
This 19-month-old child shows signs of ASD. He has an intense interest in the toy phone. He does not share his enjoyment of the phone with others. He does not look toward others and smile.
Shows, sensory all kinds. He really has this addiction to telephones lately, though. It's okay though, because it's helping him to sound. So there's probably like 10 telephones laying around my house because he walks around carrying them and sits them down, and then he goes on to the next one.
Although he puts the phone to his ear, he does not show creative play with the phone. When his name is called, he does not respond.
Elliot. Ellie. Ellie. Elliot.
He does not offer the phone to others so that they can have a turn.
He would turn to his phone, and progressively he's not.
His mother tries to distract his attention away from the phone.
Let mommy see the phone. Let mommy see it. Let mommy see the phone. Are you being helpful now? Are you being there? You are.
She begins to tickle him. Although he seems to enjoy the tickling, he does not look at his mother or make a social connection with her. He does not try to communicate with his mom to keep the social game going.
So that's a little bit of a side-by-side presentation, and you can really clearly see the difference in the number of learning opportunities and active engagement that's happening with those two children. And another thing that's really important to consider is that when the child themselves, due to the way that their brain is developing, isn't initiating interactions with caregivers or isn't responding when caregivers initiate interactions, what caregivers are very likely to do is to stop initiating so much. That's just natural. If you're not getting anything from the initiation with your child over time, you're going to do that less and less. So part of what we talk about in early intervention, and especially in parent coaching, is what are the strategies that the parent can engage in to help promote those social interactions, even though the child isn't as responsive. So it's being quite persistent with the way that you're presenting things and the way that you're trying to get kids hooked in and get their attention to what's happening socially and get them sort of plugged into what's going on. So that's one of the really exciting things about early intervention as well. So this is another lookbook from Autism Navigator. This is from the First Words Project. And this talks through 16 different gestures that kids should be able to engage in by about 16 months. So this is one of the things that you might look out for if you have concerns about your child's development, is as early as 9 months, kids will start to develop these gestures. And this expands to more and more complicated things. And these are really critical early milestones to language and learning. When we talk in the Early Start Denver model, we talk about talking bodies, and the sort of precursors to learning language happen way before we ever start making sounds that resemble words. It's really about these ways that we communicate with our bodies and those nonverbal communication systems that is one of the core criteria of autism spectrum disorder. So definitely an area that we can look at supporting for really young kids. So if you do have concerns, there are some screening resources. Baby Navigator has a social communication checkup. So you just have to be a parent of a child with autism. You can join, and you'll be invited to complete this screening tool every 3 months. This is a research project. So by joining, you will have access to all of the resources there, but it is in exchange for you sharing your information about your child's development. Of course, the purpose of that is to help more and more families and kids by getting more information and using that for research purposes, but some families may or may not be comfortable with that. So I just like to make that clear. So if we have concerns, we're looking at different early intervention service options. We're going to review what some of those are so that we can talk about the specifics around them in a little bit more detail. But these are some of the most common types of service delivery. Going back to what we talked about with neuroplasticity, this is really this graph here shows really the case for early intervention. So if we look along this line here, we have age. So starting with 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, all the way up to 7 years, so a lifetime. And this blue line represents the brain's ability to change in response to experiences. So when kids are young, the ability to change is very high because the brain is so plastic and these neural pathways have not yet been set. As we get older, we get a little bit more set in our ways, and it becomes more challenging for the brain's ability to change in response to experiences. This orange line represents the amount of effort that's required to make these changes. So in addition to really young kids having a lot of flexible brain pathways, they can change pretty easily. There's not that much effort required, but as people get older, we require more and more effort to make the same level of change. So again, case for early intervention in a nutshell, when we get in there early, children's brains are more plastic, meaning that specific early experiences that we present can more easily change the developmental trajectory that's related to social communication differences. Kids also aren't as behind when they're younger. So when we're working on early intervention, the gap is much smaller. And if we can fill that gap with those key early learning skills that babies and toddlers naturally engage in, then kids can roll with that information because they'll have those crucial early milestone skills rather than coming in a little bit later and having the gap be a bit bigger and having to catch up and direct teach every single skill as we go along. This is also supported by recent research that we've seen that actually shows that when studies of early intervention effectiveness are paired with brain scans of autistic kids before and after they receive early intervention, that several studies have found what they call normalization of brain patterns in autistic kids. So the actual brain activity that is happening in the child's brain after they receive early intervention more closely resembles that of someone who is not diagnosed with autism. Yeah,